Hello and welcome to 0%. My name is Nora. Now, today we are going to look at the process of self-awareness. We like to think of self-awareness as a process that brings us healing, that brings us clarity, and that brings us peace. But what we often overlook is that the process of self-awareness can actually be painful. And the reason of this is very simple, because in the process of being self-aware, what you are basically doing is unearthing the version of us that you have had to build to survive. Now, in our opening up the version of us that we have built to survive, then it means that we are coming into the realization of the patterns that we have normalized as part of our thinking process. We are coming into the realization of the emotions that we have learned to suppress to survive. And we are coming into the realization of the decisions that we have had to make from a place of fear, from a place of shame, from a place of anger, to mask the pain, to mask the wound, etc., etc. Okay? And that's the aspect of self-awareness that makes it painful. And this is usually not within our subconscious. When we start the process of self-awareness, we usually tend to think that it's going to bring us clarity, that it's going to bring us peace, but we overlook the pain that comes with it. I like to think of it from the analogy of a wound. Let's go through the analogy of a wound to understand the two concepts that come with it. Now, let us look at the analogy of a wound. When a wound develops, the body automatically develops a scrub on top of it to protect the wounded part from further harm. And our soul reacts in the same way. When you face a matter, when you face a situation that causes a level of brokenness, that causes a level of woundedness in us, automatically our system, our internal system, moves to creating a scrub on us to allow us to still function with a level of normalcy while still carrying around the wound. And that is the reason why you find that your mind will automatically adapt a pattern that allows it to function with the pain. You'll find that your emotions either get suppressed, or we hide emotions, we suppress emotions, we do not express the emotions that make us feel vulnerable. We learn to mask our emotions in a way that will allow us to still operate under what feels normal, new normal, based on the pain that we are feeling. And we find that our decision pattern will naturally adapt a way of making decisions that feel safer instead of making decisions that feel more authentic. And why is this? Because our soul is naturally trying to protect itself from encountering more pain, from encountering more pain on the wound that has been formed. And that is how we end up developing a personality that is masked, a personality that is covered, a personality that on the outside looks like we are still functioning, but the truth is we have masked ourselves to be able now to function in this new normalcy, in this new exposure. Yes, we have a wound, but we are moving on with our life. But the truth is, for our wound to heal, we need to remove this outer scrub that forms to protect the wound. And the removing of that scrub, we've all handled wounds in our lives. We know that wounds are not pretty. Wounds are painful. So when you remove the outer covering on the wound, it's definitely going to expose the wound. And that is the process that makes, now it exposes the pain behind the wound. In the same way, if we are to handle the brokenness, if we are to handle the version of us that we have trained to adapt to a system that feels safe, it's going to expose the wound in us. And that is what makes self-awareness painful, because of that exposure. but we think of it as a necessity to healing, as a necessity to cleaning. You have to expose the wound for you to be able to clean it. So that exposure is painful but necessary. Now we'll go through three layers. We'll go through three layers that self-awareness exposes in the process of ripping off the protective layer that built to enable us to function despite the wound. Now, layer number one is what we call pattern disruption, identity disruption. Now, as a form of protecting ourselves, we end up adapting identities that help us function in the midst of the pain, in the midst of whatever disruption that happened. Now, this identity layer that is adapted will end up looking something like being strong, being productive, being needed, or being emotionally controlled. Now, what self-awareness does with this layer is that it peels it off. Self-awareness will question, is this who I really am, or is this who I had to adapt to stay safe? Now, let's look at layer number two that the process of self-awareness tears open, and this is the layer of emotional disruption. Now, in our process of adapting and protecting ourselves from feeling more pain, we end up adapting one of several methods that people use to control their emotions. There are people who tend to suddenly get very busy to avoid sitting and feeling the emotion that comes with the wound that we carry. There are people who end up becoming emotionally numb. We don't allow ourselves to feel the pain, we don't allow ourselves to feel the confusion, we don't allow ourselves to feel the sadness that came with it. We don't allow ourselves to process the betrayal. We don't allow ourselves to process the shame that came with it. These are very heavy emotions. And our escape route is numbing. Our escape route is getting very busy with work, very busy with life. There are people who numb their emotions by going deep into drug and alcohol, substance abuse and stuff like that, binge watching social media and stuff like that. But now, what self-awareness does, it comes and rips off this layer of emotional covering or our escape route of emotions by forcing us to sit with the emotions that we have been running away from, because the truth is you cannot heal what you have not processed. And that process of actually exposing the ugly emotions that come with brokenness, it's not easy. It exposes very raw feelings that we have carried. Maybe it exposes unforgiveness that we have worked through years. It exposes our feelings of being vulnerable. It exposes a season where we went through a lot of shame, maybe. It's not a pretty process, but this is the second layer that happens when you are going through self-awareness. And that's the reason why it gets very uncomfortable. But it's necessary to go through this process for us to heal from the emotions that came with the woundedness that happens. Now, the third layer, we've gone through two layers that get exposed in the process of self-awareness. Now, the third layer is perhaps the most difficult because it's a layer of internal conflict. So what happens at this point, your pattern has been exposed. The patterns, the identity that you had to adapt to as a covering to enable you to operate, function normally has been exposed. And the second layer has exposed your emotional cover-up that you've been holding into. Now you can see the pattern clearly. This is the part where self-awareness brings clarity. Your mind can see the pattern clearly. But where there's internal conflict is this. Just because your mind can see the pattern clearly does not mean that your will be automatically designed to act in the way that is supposed to bring you healing. And this ends up bringing internal conflict within ourselves, because the mind can see clearly, but it does not directly translate to the will adapting a pattern of change because of resistance. There's a lot of resistance that comes at this point. So this is the third layer, and perhaps the most painful or the most difficult of them all, because this is where there's a lot of resistance in adapting change. Now, we have clearly gone through the patterns and the layers that get uncovered in the process of going through self-awareness and what actually makes it painful. Now, at this point, your mind can clearly see the patterns, it can clearly see the version of yourself that you had to become to survive the pain. Now, we tend to think that self-awareness brings relief, but clearly we can see that self-awareness can actually make us through a grieving process. We grieve the parts of ourselves that we had to suppress to survive. We grieve the versions of ourselves that made decisions out of fear, made decisions out of shame, instead of being authentic to who we really were. We grieve the versions of ourselves that got subjected to patterns that we had to adapt to survive. But you know what? The whole point of self-actualization is not so that we weaponize the pain against ourselves, but so we get to the point where we can understand how we became who we were for us to heal. Now, extend grace upon yourself. Extend grace upon yourself. Do not weaponize the pain. Do not weaponize the disappointment. Do not weaponize the shame. Do not shame that version of you that did not know any better. But take it as a moment of reflection and actually making decisions that are now more authentic to you, as opposed to the version of you that was making decisions, that was going through thought patterns that adapted to who we had to become to survive. So perhaps self-awareness is painful because it forces a clarity that changes how we relate with ourselves. But just think for a moment. That discomfort, that pain is not punishment, but it's actually the beginning of healing, discernment, and a more integrated way of living ourselves. So the pain is a blessing.